Prisons are tough places, but for some inmates, the real danger comes from those behind bars with them. In this video, we're exploring the 20 most horrifying executions carried out by prisoners. From infamous criminal Carl Williams, who was beaten to death, to notorious serial killer Leroy Martin, who met a gruesome end after being stabbed to death by another inmate. We're uncovering stories of vengeance and twisted justice that will shock you to your core. Let's dive right into it. Carl Williams. Known to be a drug trafficker and murderer who hailed from Melbourne, Australia, Williams was the main figure in the Melbourne gangland killings, not excluding the execution of their final victim. Williams described himself as a semi-professional gambler and was restricted from the Crown Casino on April 2, 2004 by the police. He was eventually arrested and charged for ordering the killings of 3 people and conspiracy to murder a 4th, which unfortunately was unsuccessful. The victims were Jason and Louis Moran of the prominent Moran family, criminal associate Mark Malia, and Michael Marshall, who was shot and killed in front of his young son. Williams pleaded guilty to the murders of Louis Moran, Jason Moran, and Mark Malia. He also pleaded guilty to conspiracy to murder gangland rival Mario Condello. He was subsequently sentenced to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 35 years. However, on the 19th of April 2010, while incarcerated at HM Prison Barwon, he was beaten to death by inmate Matthew Charles Johnson with the stem of a bike. While Carl was beaten to death, the next victim suffered a more brutal ending. Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Cannibal. The Milwaukee Cannibal is a notorious criminal that terrorized America. Jeffrey is known to have killed 7 men and boys between 1978 and 1991, eating some of their remains. He was captured in 1991 and sentenced to a whopping 16 life terms. According to the New York Post, another murderer, Scarver, claimed to have arrived at the prison at the same time as Dahmer in 1992. Dahmer exhibited a provocative personality in prison and was tagged the class clown. Dahmer taunted fellow inmates in the prison, assembling foods like body parts and squirting ketchup on them, depicting his cannibalistic infatuations. In a 2015 interview with the New York Post, Scarver claimed to have killed Jeffrey, hitting him with a heavy metal twice on the head. The next victim was unsurprisingly killed on the same day by Scarver, and in a manner that was equally brutal. Jesse Anderson. As a convicted murderer, Jesse Anderson was a victim of the same assailant who beat to death popular serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer in Wisconsin's highest security prison. In an interesting twist of events, he was killed alongside Jeffrey Dahmer by Scarver. He was popularly known to be a diesel oil salesman who was living in Cedarburg. In 1992, he murdered his wife, Barbara Anderson, in the parking lot of a shopping mall after the couple attended a movie show and had dinner at North Milwaukee. The police were suspicious about how Barbara was murdered. It doesn't look anything like a stranger assault. Anderson claimed that 2 men had attacked him and his wife. He further gave police an LA Clippers basketball cap he claimed to have knocked off the head of one of the assailants. However, 2 people testified against him with the evidence of selling the cap and a red-handled fishing knife to him. Eventually, Anderson was convicted of the murder of his wife. He was subsequently sentenced to life in prison with the option of parole after 60 years. In 1994, while imprisoned at Columbia Correctional Institution, Scarver picked up a steel bar and got into a confrontation with Anderson's cellmate, Jeffrey Dahmer, who was a serial killer. After fatally striking Dahmer on the head, Scarver also tracked down Anderson and hit him as well. While Dahmer was declared dead about 1 hour after the attack, Anderson died 2 days later. While Anderson's fate was sealed by the same inmate who killed Dahmer, the next victim's execution was even more shocking due to the stories surrounding his demise. Leslie Bailey. Nicknamed Cat Weasel, Bailey was a notorious pedophile and murderer involved in the brutal sexual abuse and killing of at least 3 young boys in London during the 1980s. Bailey, along with Sidney Cook and others, lured 7-year-old Mark Tildesley away from a fun fair in June 1984, promising him sweets. Mark was then drugged and strangled during a horrific act of sexual violence. His body was never found, and his death only came to light after the gang was imprisoned for the murder of another boy, Jason Swift. In 1985, Jason Swift, another young victim, was found in a field in Essex, having been drugged, sexually assaulted, and asphyxiated by the gang at a squalid flat in Hackney. In the 1989 trial, the gang members blamed each other, resulting in manslaughter convictions for 4 of them. Bailey, already serving time for Jason's murder, admitted to his role in Mark's death and was the only one convicted in connection with it, pleading guilty to manslaughter in 1992. He was killed in his prison cell in October 1993 by 2 other inmates. The CPS found there was insufficient evidence to prosecute Cook and another gang member, as their cases relied heavily on Bailey's testimony. While Leslie Bailey's death was staged as a suicide by fellow inmates, the next victim's death was equally puzzling due to its bizarre circumstances. John Jogan. He was a Catholic priest in Boston who was known for sexually abusing children. Despite his history of abuse, he was repeatedly reassigned to different parishes where he continued to interact with children. This led to more cases of abuse over the years. Giocan's crimes were part of a larger scandal in the Catholic Church that involved many priests accused of abusing children. The scandal caused a lot of outrage and led to the resignation of Boston's Archbishop, Cardinal Bernard Law, in 2002. It was revealed that Law and other church leaders had moved priests accused of abuse to new parishes instead of addressing the problem. In 2002, Giocan was convicted of sexual abuse and sentenced to 9 to 10 years in prison. However, less than a year later, on August 23, 2003, he was killed by another inmate, Joseph Druce, while in protective custody at Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center. Druce strangled and stomped Giocan to death in his cell. The case of John Giocan and the wider scandal in Boston were central to the 2015 film Spotlight, which highlighted the widespread abuse in the Catholic Church. While Giocan's death brought an end to a scandalous chapter, the next victim was a tragic case of neglect and injustice. Yuri Galanskov. A participant in the popular poetry readings in Mayakovsky Square, he is one of the most prominent Soviet writers and protesters of the early and mid-1960s. He was a renowned Russian poet, historian, human rights activist, and dissident. He engaged in political activities, such as founding and editing Samizdat Almanac Phoenix. His first publication in 1961, Phoenix, came as a direct criticism of the Soviet government in the form of poetry. This triggered the Union to seek his arrest. He was incarcerated in prisons, camps, and forced treatment in psychiatric hospitals, believing he is insane. He was released thereafter, but he forged a partnership with Alexander Ginsberg, agreeing to publish their work in the West. He was sentenced to 7 years in jail under a strict regime at labor camp number 17 in the Mordovian complex of camps in January 1968 on charges of circulating anti-Soviet propaganda. In partnership with Ginsberg, he sent a letter describing the dilapidated conditions of the camp and the cruel guards at the labor camp. The letter was taken out of Russia to be published in the West. He advocated for prisoners, but while going through his bitter ordeal in prison, suffered a bleeding ulcer, which was not attended to by the authorities. In an effort by another inmate to treat him, he was operated on by the inexperienced prisoner, hence causing his tragic death. Galanskov's death was a tragic result of medical neglect, but the next victim faced a more violent and sudden end. Roger Kibbe. The California serial killer and rapist was dubbed the 1-5 Strangler during the 1970s and 1980s, was a former suburban Sacramento furniture maker whose brother was a law enforcement officer. Most of his victims were found on the freeway of Sacramento, California. He kidnapped his victims, tied them up with parachute rigging cords, and silenced them with duct tape. He cut open the clothes of his victims in irregular shapes with scissors that were passed down to him by his mother. Kibbe's first arrest in 1987 was for assault and battery after unsuccessfully attempting to handcuff prostitute Deborah Ann Guffey. The prostitute fought back by screaming, which was heard by the police. He was tried and sent to 8 months imprisonment. During his time in prison, murder cases were charged against him. There were many murder cases levied against him during his time in prison, such as the murder of Darcy Frackenpole and Lou Ellen Burley, to name a few. A 40-year-old Jason Budrow confessed to having murdered Kibbe to avenge the death of his victims. He was strangled to death by the self-acclaimed Satanist at approximately 12:40 a.m. on February 28, 2021, in Mule Creek State Prison. While Kibbe was a notorious killer and killed by a Satanist, the next person had a gruesome ending. Richard A. Loeb. An extremely intelligent student birthed by wealthy Jewish parents who lived in Kenwood, Chicago. At 12 years old, he was admitted into the innovative University High School. With the governess encouraging him, he completed his high school education in 2 years. In 1923, at 17 years old, he became the University of Michigan's youngest graduate. He grew up fantasizing about committing the perfect crime with Nathan Leopold. He was a law student from the University of Chicago. He has a passion for reading, a passion for history and crime stories. Their infatuation about the perfect murder was derived from their readings. The victim of their fantasies was the young Bobby Franks. The pair got rid of Bobby's body but unknowingly left a pair of glasses at the scene that was traced to Loeb. They were convicted of kidnapping and killing Bobby Franks in 1924, and their crime was regarded as the crime of the century in January 1936. They evaded the death penalty but were sentenced to life imprisonment. While in a private shower, Loeb was razor-slashed roughly 56 times by his former cellmate James A. Day, who claimed he acted in self-defense after Loeb allegedly made homosexual advances toward him. While Loeb was savagely murdered in a supposed act of self-defense, the next victim's death was the result of a long-standing cycle of violence. Sidonio Teixeira. A child killer at one of Britain's most high-security prisons has been beaten to death while serving his sentence, was Metro News headline. Teixeira was one of the few criminals given a life sentence penalty. He had little to no chance of release from prison in the UK. While he was being interrogated, he admitted to killing his 3-year-old daughter and also an attempted murder of his 9-year-old son in 2007. He was a member of a liquidation squad in the Philippines, convicted for the death of his 3-year-old daughter, famously known for the quote, "I am wrong to kill somebody, but it's my job. When I was in my country, I was a member of the liquidation squad. Sometimes you have to punish evil." He was killed by Victor Castigador, who had killed 2 guards by setting them ablaze and leaving 2 other guards severely burnt. Castigador was also known as an enforcer. It was reported that Sidonio was killed with a large stone contained in a sock taken from the prison's fish tank. While Teixeira was killed with aquarium stones, the next victim wouldn't have imagined the cannibal-like ending awaiting him. Mitchell Harrison. Known to have lived in both the Cockermouth and Whitehaven areas, he was popular for his criminal record of raping a 13-year-old girl. At 13, he was served a formal warning by the authorities for indecently assaulting a 7-year-old. He would be convicted for his crime and sent to prison 1 year later in 2010 for raping a teenage girl in 2009. At his hearing, he was known to have threatened to rape a 15-year-old girl while grabbing her breasts. It was in Kendal he carried out his criminal mission after moving to South Cumbria. At the time of his death, he was sentenced to an indeterminate sentence of nothing less than 4.5 years. Harrison, while serving his term, was butchered by 2 fellow cons who cut out his stomach in one of Britain's toughest jails. Parr, 32 and 23-year-old man, allegedly targeted Harrison in Durham's Franklin jail because of his sickening history of child sex offenses. The inmate confessed to killing him because he felt no remorse for his actions. He had slashed him in the neck and left to bleed to death, intending to eat his liver not until the last minutes. A jail source said the brutal attack was like something out of a medieval torture chamber, leaving him disemboweled. While Harrison was brutally disemboweled in a medieval-like attack, the next prisoner's death remained an unsolved mystery shrouded in intrigue. Albert DeSalvo. He was known as the two-faced criminal, Boston Strangler, and Green Man. He confessed to killing 13 women in Boston between 1962 and 1964 while being hypnotized. Before strangling the majority of his victims with a piece of their clothes, he sexually assaulted them while several others were stabbed to death. During that period, the police also sought a suspect they called the Green Man. The suspect was known to be wearing green pants. The suspect sexually assaulted ladies. DeSalvo was tried as only the Green Man and was found guilty of 10 counts of charges of armed robbery and sexual assault. He was subsequently sentenced to life imprisonment on January 18, 1967. While in prison, he was reported to be selling illegal drugs for less than the inmate enforced price, thus making him a target. On November 25, 1973, at Walpole State Prison, now known as Massachusetts Correctional Institution, he was found dead. He had been wounded by another inmate in the infirmary. None of the inmates confessed to what happened to him, leaving his death a mystery. DeSalvo's mysterious death left many questions, but the next casualty faced a fatal assault with no chance of survival. Jose Antonio Rodriguez Vega. Dubbed El Mataviejas, the old lady killer, Antonio is a Spanish serial killer who wreaked havoc on older women in Cantabria. His criminal act was as a result of revenge towards his mother, whom he hated after kicking him out for beating his terminally ill father. He was sentenced to 27 years in prison, but due to good behavior and his ability to have his victims forgive him, he had his sentence reduced to 8 years. He lost his first marriage after he was arrested and released, leading to depression and marrying a mentally unstable woman whom he tortured and humiliated privately while keeping a good public image. He was arrested again in 1988, and this time he confessed to the killings levied against him. He murdered at least 16 women after getting familiar with them. In August 1987, he raped and brutally killed Margarita Gonzalez, an 82-year-old woman whom he forced to swallow her false teeth. His trial started in November 1991 in Santander. He was convicted for the murder of 16 women and eventually sentenced to a whopping 440 years in prison. Unfortunately, he was killed on October 24th by 2 inmates who stabbed him 114 times. While Jose was killed by 2 inmates, the next victim was killed by an inmate who committed suicide. Leroy Martin. Very little is known about this serial killer. He was born and raised in Gaffney, South Carolina, America, where he lived a seemingly normal life. In 1957, he was convicted of assault and battery to kill a teenage girl in the woods. He married and fathered 3 sons after serving a hard labor sentence. Martin was known to work at a local mill and also as a part-time cab driver. He worked in a textile mill and had a wife and 3 children. Behind that facade, he was a terror that wreaked havoc on women in the area. He was hardly suspected until a manhunt was arranged to get the criminal. Before he was apprehended apprehended by the police, he was seen close to a crime scene by two residents who volunteered to join the hunting team. While he was imprisoned at the Central Correctional Institution, he confessed to his mother that it was his violent half that controls his physical condition that committed the 4 murders charged against him. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms, but only managed to serve 4 years before he was killed by another inmate, Kenneth Rumsey, at the Central Correctional Institution in South Carolina. While Martin met an untimely end in the hands of another inmate, the next victim was murdered by 2 inmates. Charles Schmid, popularly known as the Pied Piper of Tucson, he regularly hung out with a group of teenagers. He was raised by a single mother who later left him to be adopted by Charles and Catherine Schmid, who owned and operated Hillcrest Nursing Home in Tucson, Arizona. Schmid wasn't a brilliant student in school, but was very good at gymnastics, leading his school to a state championship. Before graduating, he was suspended for stealing tools in the school machine shop, but never returned to school. Charles later became a serial killer in the area of Tucson and took the lives of 3 promising young ladies in the 1960s. His crime was detailed by journalist Don Moser in his article issue of Life magazine on March 4, 1966. His criminal stories formed the foundation of writer Joyce Carol Oates' short story, Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? He was convicted for his crimes after one of his hanging out friends helped in the investigation. However, he escaped from prison. In 1972, he was recaptured and not so long met his end 3 years after in a horrific attack by 2 other inmates who plugged out his eyes before stabbing him 47 times while removing his kidney. While Schmid's death was a gory sight to behold, that of the next victim was more horrible. James Whitey Bulger. Dubbed as the American organized crime boss, James led 2 major groups to wreak havoc in the Winter Hill neighborhood of Somerville. He was the father of Douglas Glenn during his 12 years relationship with his wife, a waitress, Lindsay Sear. At a time in the United States, James was the most wanted fugitive due to his number of atrocities. For 17 years, he was living as a fugitive. He was also an FBI informant for many years, which didn't make him many friends with the criminals. The murder of Louis Latif, a crime and drug dealer, was levied on him. After killing Latif, James had stuffed him into a garbage bag and left him in his car's trunk. He was arrested in 2011 and handed 2 consecutive life sentences due to his record of crimes, including murder. He was moved from prison to prison before he was sent to the penitentiary in Hazleton on October 29, 2018. Less than 24 hours into the prison, he was left dead in an unrecognizable state by several inmates, his eye gouged out and his tongue almost cut off. His death was not surprising looking at his criminal records. While Bulger's end came quickly after his prison transfer, Donald Harvey, known as the Angel of Death, faced a slower demise. Donald Harvey, Angel of Death. At the beginning of his horrible mission, Donald, who worked as a nurse aide, convinced himself that patients who he killed using pillows were chronically ill cardiac patients who needed relief from pain. He was born in Ohio and the eldest of 3 children of Ray and Goldie Harvey. From a very young age, he was sexually molested by his uncle and a neighbor and never told anyone except his sister. He is a self-professed angel of death. Having killed 70 people, he was only convicted for killing 37 people in 1987. It was believed he committed many crimes that went unpunished because they were undetected for so long. His victims were also of no particular class. It was believed that he poisoned his lover and roommate, Carl Howiller, by suspecting him of infidelity. He also poisoned 2 of his neighbors, Diane Alexander and Helen Metzger. Harvey ultimately pleaded guilty to 37 murders, having confessed to killing as many as 50 people. He was sent to the Ohio prison system on October 26, 1987. In March 2017, Harvey was found in his cell severely beaten. He died 2 days later. James Elliott, who was serving his time for multiple burglaries, confessed to killing Harvey, and as a result, he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison run concurrently with his other sentences. While Donald's death was perpetuated by another serial killer, the next victim was shot a dozen times by his fellow inmates. John Moreno Torres. Popularly known as Johnny the Leper, John was a serial killer born in Bogota, Colombian capital. As a teenager, he suffered a burn on his leg which resulted in people calling him Johnny the Leper. By the age of 13, he had dropped out of school and become the leader of a dangerous gang in Bogota's Fontibon and Kennedy neighborhoods. Under his leadership, the gang committed multiple murders and rapes and took over the local drug trade. The Colombian authorities launched an investigation to capture Moreno Torres and his gang members. They tracked down his partner's location, and Once Torres arrived, he was immediately arrested. It was believed that John killed between 10 to 20 people. However, he was only convicted for 4 murders. All of his murders were reported to be violent and carried out with vehemence. In one case, a victim was shot, dismembered, burned, and the remains were scattered in the street. He was imprisoned in La Modelo prison in Bogotá. At the age of 19, he was killed there by several inmates using a firearm. He was shot 12 times and stabbed with sharp objects. While Torres met a violent end, the next victim was lynched by fellow inmates under different circumstances. Enriqueta Martí. She is dubbed Vampire of Barcelona. She was a famous child serial killer and prostitute. She had a failed marriage due to infidelity and had no child with painter Pujalo. In 1909, Martí opened her brothel, attracting some of Barcelona's most affluent. Some of them had unusual desires which she accommodated for a premium. Her method of abduction was weird. She disguised as a beggar to kidnap abandoned children on the street during the day and act like a poor woman to join bread queues at the monasteries to find the most abandoned-looking children. At the time of her prostituting, she acted as a witch doctor, claiming drinking the blood of children can cure tuberculosis. She also offered creams and elixirs she claimed to stop aging. The remains of the children she killed were major ingredients of the products she sold. Due to the usage of her victims' remains, she had no problem disposing of them off. She tried committing suicide while in jail but failed. 1 year, 3 months later, she was lynched and killed by her fellow inmates who were believed to have been paid to kill her. Authorities claimed she died of uterine cancer. While Marty's death was shrouded in mystery, the next victim was openly killed by his cellmate in a brutal attack. Billy Kamirmir. He was a Kenyan living in the United States permanently with a green card. He has a criminal record of driving under influence in Dallas and Addison. Between 2010 and 2016, he faced multiple charges, including trespassing. Kamirmir's crimes involved posing as a healthcare or maintenance worker to gain access to the homes of elderly women, where he would smother them with a pillow. Police believe he may have been involved in other deaths initially considered natural. He was arrested in March 2018 for the murder of an 81-year-old woman. Kamirmir was indicted on 22 capital charges of murder. 13 of them were committed in Dallas County, while 9 in Collin County. After a series of trials, he was convicted in 2022 of 2 murders and sentenced to life in prison. Unfortunately, Kamirmir was killed by his cellmate Wyatt Busby on September 19, 2023, at a Texas prison. Busby was serving a 50-year sentence for another murder and reportedly acted in retaliation for comments Kamirmir made. It was reported that Kamirmir made sexual comments about Busby children. While Kamirmir's end was due to personal revenge, the next victim was killed by a fellow inmate after being released due to a clerical error. Robert Liberty. Known as the Candlelight Killer, he was an American serial killer who murdered people. He is famously known for killing 2 men in Southern California from March to June 1970 in a ritualistic style, as he often left taunting messages behind for authorities. Liberty murdered Marcella Landis after she tried to commit suicide. He had strangled her to death with a silk stocking. By 1969, psychiatrists who had interviewed Liberty had all claimed he had recovered. He moved to Costa Mesa living with 3 other men. Unfortunately, he brutally shot one of his roommates, Thomas Astorina, who had 2 children. He also brutally killed Robert Irian after tying him down and lighting a candle on his with the caption, "The Candlelight Killer Strikes Again," while also writing, "Catch me if you can." On June 2, 1969, Liberty walked out of Metropolitan State Hospital a free man after his doctor mislabeled him as discharged. However, he was brought to trial on January 20, 1971. Unfortunately for him, he, along with his cellmate Paul Eugene Rankin, was strangled to death by another cellmate, Timothy Earl Dudley, who ended up being sentenced to life imprisonment after pleading guilty to committing the act. As demonstrated in each of these stories, even behind bars, a darker fate awaits those with bloody pasts. Click the card on your screen for more chilling tales.